Mr. Durbin is, as Abraham Lincoln himself was, a legislator and a lawyer. It is fashionable today to criticize the governmental and legal professions. And yet I think, and I say this not as a law dean, but as a citizen, the problem is not that we have too many lawyers in government, but that we have far fewer than we used to, and that we certainly have too few who deeply understand America's fundamental law, the Constitution. I can tell you from having followed his career that Senator Durbin is, like Abraham Lincoln was, first and foremost a top-notch constitutional lawyer, and that the insights he offers from this distinctive perspective will be distinctively valuable. And third, I literally, and unlike many people, when I use that word, I do mean literally, cannot think of a more important time for us to collectively reflect on the essential lessons to be drawn from Abraham Lincoln's life and work. We are in the midst of an election that in some ways is unprecedented, but that in many other ways finds a very powerful precedent from Lincoln's day. Perhaps the last time the nation seemed so bitterly and regionally divided among presidential candidates was 1860. And perhaps the last electoral moment when all four most important organs of the federal government, the House, the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court, were up for grabs, as they are right now, was 1864. It pains me to think that large numbers of Americans worry that our elections are rigged when this country has fought so hard to maintain an unbroken tradition of free and fair electoral contests, even in the midst of a civil war. We should remember that Mr. Lincoln believed during the summer of 1864 that he was likely to lose the election in November of that year, and that he also knew he probably could have gotten away with postponing the election on account of the war, and yet he insisted that Americans have their regularly scheduled opportunity to weigh in, and he pledged in advance to fully honor the result. Tonight's speaker has accomplished something Abraham Lincoln sought but was never able to attain: election to the U.S. Senate. Mr. Durbin has served in the Senate for almost 20 years and is the senior senator from Illinois. He has held a number of key leadership positions in the Senate and is currently the assistant minority leader, the second highest ranking leadership position within the Senate Democrats. He serves on many important committees and subcommittees, including the Senate Judiciary Committee. Before being elected to the Senate, he worked in private practice and state government, and he served in the U.S. House of Representatives for over a decade. He is a lifelong Illinoisan, born in East St. Louis. He received his undergraduate and law degrees from Georgetown, but I'd like to think that he sometimes wishes he were an Illini. For tonight at least, he is one. So let's give him a hand and welcome Senator Durbin.
To Dean Moore, the faculty, staff, and students, thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm honored to be part of the Lincoln Lecture Series here at the University of Illinois Sponsorville College of Law. And yes, I would be an honorary Illini this evening, happily so. It's a great university I'm honored to represent. I'm here to speak about Abraham Lincoln, and as the Dean mentioned, he did aspire to the United States Senate. Had he been successful in 1858 in defeating Stephen Douglas, we might have had a different course of history and perhaps a different speaker and a different topic this evening. But that is not what history dealt him, and it took 2 years for him to aspire and reach the office of president and become a major force in the history of this nation. He is no ordinary figure. Many argue he is the central figure in our history. Asking what Lincoln means today is a timely question, but especially now as we're just weeks away from a presidential election that has exposed old wounds that Lincoln knew well. When I think back to my service in Congress, the House, and the Senate, I can't remember how many times I've turned to the story of Lincoln's life or his timeless words for insight and inspiration. His life on the raw frontier of America, his presidency in the crucible of the deadliest war in our history, his mission to save the nation from bitter divisions which threatened its very existence. At Gettysburg, with an economy of style and an expansive view of the meaning of that day, Lincoln challenged the nation to dedicate itself to the unfinished work of democracy. That unfinished work continues. We've come a long way. Let me tell you about one historic night in Lincoln's hometown of Springfield. The year was 1909. 2,000 people had gathered at a dazzling gala to honor the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth. Even though this was an event celebrating the life of the president who abolished slavery, it was a segregated event. The Chicago Tribune reported, quote, "It is to be a lily-white affair from start to finish." But across town, the black community organized its own celebration at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The Reverend L.H. McGee spoke at that gathering and noted the widespread feeling of hurt over the exclusion of people of color from the main Lincoln banquet. Reverend McGee then asked his audience to join him and look ahead to a better time. He predicted that 100 years in the future, quote, "Prejudice shall have been banished as a myth and relegated to the dark days of Salem witchcraft." I recently shared that story when I had the honor of introducing the keynote speaker at a dinner, again in Springfield, celebrating Lincoln's bicentennial of his birth. The celebration I was honored to co-chair with my friend and Lincoln scholar, Harold Holzer, and Congressman LaHood. That keynote speaker at the celebration that I spoke before was America's newly elected president, Barack Obama. I like to think that Reverend McGee was watching over us. I hope he was pleased at how far we have come to address discrimination. But I also know, and we all know, we have a long way to go to live up to what Reverend McGee and President Lincoln believed. And that is the magic of Lincoln. As time passes, 151 years since his death, he's still relevant. Why? Not because he was a seer, but because he saw with clarity the existential challenges to American democracy. Some of the challenges were the central questions of his day, and they remain in our day. Lincoln not only saw the challenges more clearly than anyone, he described them more clearly than anyone. As the dean said, "I'm a lawyer, legislator, and I know firsthand the power of the written and spoken word. Very few, if any, have had the extraordinary gift to make words march and sing like Abraham Lincoln." From the simple alliteration of the Gettysburg Address, where he summarized our nation's essence of the people, by the people, and for the people, to haunting phrases like the mystic chords of memory, Lincoln could write, speak, and turn words into inspiration. In his second inaugural address, with thousands of fresh graves, the battlefield still stained with blood, he urged a war-torn nation to come together in peace, quote, "with malice toward none, with charity for all." That's a sentiment in short supply in today's politics. One might expect to find this talent to turn these phrases in a well-educated, well-read man. But we know that Lincoln had little formal education, and the core of his early reading was the Bible and the works of Shakespeare. Somehow, the man in the moment produced a genius that yielded the words and the sentiments our nation desperately needed. I'm humbled by his economy of expression. At Gettysburg, his words endured, while the bloviation of his contemporaries is mercifully lost to the ages. Lincoln proved that a speech need not be eternal to be immortal. I will try to follow that lesson this evening. Many of us may be familiar with Professor Martha Coates, the historian and author of Mourning Lincoln. She recently spoke to a classroom of fourth graders. The teacher had asked her to come talk about Lincoln and give these young children an insight into Lincoln. So Professor Hodes did her best to paint a full picture of the great man, the good, the bad, what he meant to America. She told the children about a classroom in the South made up of freed slaves and their reaction to the news that President Lincoln had been assassinated. When they heard the news, one little girl took off her bonnet, cut it into 26 pieces, and passed the swatches around so that each student would have a mourning badge. The children all cried. Professor Hodes said that many of the fourth graders later wrote to her, expressing how moved they were by this history. Even after all these years, Lincoln holds the power to move and inspire. Now, I was about the same age as those students when I first began to reflect on the greatness of Lincoln. As the dean mentioned, I grew up in East St. Louis, just across the Mississippi River from the city of St. Louis. One day, while still in grade school, I was walking with my mother in downtown St. Louis. We walked up by the Old Courthouse, and some of you know what I'm speaking of, on the banks of the Mississippi. It was the same building where in 1854, a federal court had ruled that Dred Scott was not a man with inalienable rights, but a piece of property to be bought and sold. That ruling led to the Supreme Court's shameful decision in 1857, upholding the lower court's decision, and was one of the events that made the Civil War inevitable. As we stood at the Old Courthouse that day, my mother pointed to the white stone steps on the east side of the building. And she said, and I will forever remember, it was right there. It was there where they sold men and women and children your age as slaves. Families were ripped apart. Slaves were shipped like cattle down the Mississippi to the deep south. Dred Scott himself had probably seen these human beings being brought on those steps as he entered the courthouse seeking justice. In grade school, my connection to Lincoln was limited to memorizing the Gettysburg Address. But as I thought about slavery and ending it at the old St. Louis courthouse, I began to understand more deeply what it must have taken to end that evil at the risk of death and dividing America. We all know that Lincoln led the nation through a war to save the Union, abolish slavery, and began the work we continue to end discrimination. But what was driving Lincoln to risk everything to end the peculiar institution of slavery? Reflecting on his childhood, Lincoln once said, "I used to be a slave," but he quickly joked, "and now I'm so free that they let me practice law." It was one of the countless times Lincoln tried to use humor to mask pain. You see, until he was 21 years old, Lincoln's father rented him out to neighbors to perform manual labor for pennies a day. Young Lincoln didn't see a single cent from his labor. Rather, he saw himself as an oppressed young man without rights, a form of slavery. Lincoln was born in the backwoods of Kentucky in grinding poverty that was more like a prison. Survival was the goal, not upward mobility. His barely literate father discouraged formal education and thought Abraham's love of reading was just a waste of time. Lincoln hated the deprivation of his childhood, particularly the physical labor that frontier life offered, but it fueled an ambition to escape. He was humiliated by his upbringing and would later compare it to Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, a poem condemning the poor as people, quote, born to toil, not to aspire. The great emancipator had to free himself from imprisonment in a world of poverty and obscurity, and he achieved his freedom of hard work, mostly self-taught and seizing opportunities, combined with a fierce desire to rise in the world. This helped create the Lincoln we've come to know today, although it took decades to fully escape his narrow upbringing and fully evolve. Following Lincoln's death, the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass said of him, quote, "The first great man that I talked with in the United States freely, who in no single instance reminded me of the difference of color." And Douglass attributed this to the fact that he and Lincoln were men, quote, both starting at the lowest rung of the ladder. Following the election of 1860, the Chicago Tribune described that youthful Lincoln as toiling under the weight of poverty with a view of better days. That summed up his childhood, his rise to national prominence, ultimately his presidency. More importantly, it summed up what became his guiding principle, that liberty begins with freedom of opportunity, what Lincoln would call in his day the right to rise. Lincoln understood that for liberty to truly exist, the right to rise must exist. And in pursuit of liberty and the right to rise, Lincoln offered more than words, freedom from slavery, or even his own example of climbing the economic ladder. He offered the collective will of the American people working together in what we call government. Lincoln understood that government could help. He used government to help those who couldn't help themselves. Lincoln said, quote, "We made the experiment and the fruit is before us. Look at it, think of it." Lincoln was shaped by events, but it was in those events that Lincoln saw opportunity and used government to end the evil experiment of slavery. Lincoln believed government could offer opportunity and endless possibility, not just protection. In 1832, as a candidate unsuccessfully for a seat in the Illinois General Assembly, he said, quote, "My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I'm in favor of a national bank. I'm in favor of internal improvement and a high protective tariff. Lincoln understood that promoting and enthusiastically supporting the nation's infrastructure helped common people, working class people, people like him. At the heart of his philosophy was that government should lift up the penniless beginner and every poor man be given a chance to succeed. And during the Civil War, the most difficult time in the history of our country, Lincoln believed and actively pursued investing in that noble objective. Even as Lincoln led the fight to preserve the Union, Lincoln was laying the foundation for a modern economy, creating the conditions for America to flourish. He invested in infrastructure, transcontinental railroad, and the network of canals connecting our nation. Historian James McPherson said President Lincoln signed an astonishing blitz of laws. Lincoln knew that America would prosper in the new economy only if the average man or woman prospered as well. So he committed America to investing in the most precious resource in our infrastructure, the minds of the people. In 1862, when the fate of the Union was still in doubt, Lincoln signed into law the Morrill Act, creating a land-grant university system that touched every existing state in the Union. Democracy's colleges, that's what they called them, were not just new universities, but a new kind of university. They were based on what was still a controversial idea, that education should be practical as well as intellectual. Land-grant colleges democratized education in frontier America, made it possible for the sons and daughters of farmers and tradesmen to access greater economic opportunity through education. Scores of colleges and universities in America, including this University of Illinois, exist today because at the darkest time in our history, leaders like Lincoln could see a better America. And their vision made our university system the envy of the world. During his presidency, he oversaw the establishment of the Department of Agriculture with government support for modern farming and affordable farming equipment, the reestablishment of control over the American banking system in crisis, and he signed the Homestead Act, allowing all Americans, including freed slaves, to move west and claim up to 163 acres of land, producing tens of thousands of independent farms. Lincoln's support of these measures provided greater opportunity for generations of Americans in pursuit of happiness, the right to rise. Steven Spielberg's movie, Lincoln, which I've seen a few times and maybe you have too, starred Daniel Day-Lewis. There's a scene where Lincoln is talking with Congressman Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, played by Tommy Lee Jones. Thaddeus Stevens had a reputation as one of the most righteous, uncompromising abolitionists in American history, and thank goodness for him. In the movie, he tells Lincoln, there's no use appealing to white people's sense of moral decency to end slavery and racial discrimination. He says, and I quote, you know the inner compass that should direct the soul toward justice has ossified in white men and women, north and south, into utter uselessness through tolerating the evil of slavery. Here's what Lincoln said, or according to Harold Holzer, my friend and Lincoln historian, what screenwriter Tony Kushner demanded that he say, and I quote, a compass? I learned about that when I was surveying, Lincoln said. It'll point you true north from where you're standing, but it's got no advice about the swamps and desert and chasm that you'll encounter along the way. If in pursuit of your destination you plunge ahead heedless of obstacles and achieve nothing more than to sink into a swamp, what's the use of even knowing true north? Lincoln was dedicated to liberty and the right to rise, but he was practical and focused. A good example is Lincoln's 1862 letter to Horace Greeley. Some pointed to it as an example of Lincoln equivocating on slavery. They point to quotes like, quote, if I could save the Union without freeing the slave, I'd do it. But Lincoln also said, what I do about slavery, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. This is important, because while writing to Greeley, Lincoln already had a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in his pocket. He knew exactly what he was doing. We've come a long way. We still have a lot of work to do to keep the promise of this nation, to make sure that we're fair, more equal, and to do what Lincoln called nobly save the last best hope on earth. So how can we use the Lincoln lessons taught us in his day to address the challenges we face today? You know that higher education has never been more important, but the cost of attaining it has skyrocketed over the past few decades. putting college out of reach of so many low and middle income families, or saddling them with insurmountable debt. That's a choice no one should have to make, but it's a choice millions of families face each year. We know that education is often the key to climbing the economic ladder. Many of us are living proof. But without access to affordable education, lower income families don't have the right to rise. The foundation for Lincoln's new economy was a fair shot, and he used government to promote the endeavor. Lincoln said, upon the subject of education, I can only say that I view it as the most important subject which we have as a people to engage in. So what would Lincoln say about today, when students growing up in households making at least $116,000 annual income make up more than half of all college graduates, while students growing up in households making less than $35,000 make up just 10% of all college graduates in America? The gap between wealthier students and those who grew up in poor households is widening. For far too many, that's not a fair shot, it's a long shot, and not the opportunity Lincoln had promised. Student debts are the new shackles that obstruct dreams, careers, starting families, owning a home, and the freedom to retire with dignity. Lincoln said, at its best, government exists to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear paths of laudable pursuits for all. It's time to recommit to Lincoln's vision, break the shackles, work toward affordable education for all, and root out injustices that disproportionately harm the most vulnerable in America. And we cannot talk about injustice and inequality in America today without mentioning our criminal justice system. After more than 40 years of the so-called war on drugs and being, quote, tough on crime, let's look at where we are. This war on drugs has created an unprecedented growth in American prisons and the public budgets that support them. The war on drugs has filled America's jails and prisons with thousands of nonviolent drug offenders, mostly poor people of color. The numbers sadly tell the story. The United States has less than 5% of the world's population. We have nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. America today locks up black people at a far higher rate than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. And the price tag is considerable, at least $30,000 a year to incarcerate a person in federal prison. It's taking money that could help fulfill the agenda that Lincoln preached of saving a crumbling infrastructure and educating people across America and turning it into prisoners. But our broken criminal justice system is not colorblind, and it needs to be reformed. People of color are disproportionately arrested, convicted, and incarcerated in America. We are beyond the original sin of slavery, but we're not guiltless when it comes to discrimination and perpetuating the color divide in America. Along with growing income inequality, there are great civil rights challenges of our time, real threats to our democracy. Over the last 30 years, the bulk of our nation's economic growth has gone to the top 1/100th of 1% of our population, who make on average $27 million a year per household. The average salary for the bottom 90% of Americans, slightly above $31,000. At no time in our modern history have so few owned so much of the wealth. So what's the impact of income inequality? Well, it can be summed up in many words, but Bill Moyers said it best. On economic growth, it slows. On health, it undermines. On social cohesion and solidarity, it erodes. On education, affordable housing, and other public services, it starves. On government, it hijacks. That's not what Lincoln had as a vision of democracy. It's not what Lincoln meant during the Civil War. When rallying a group of soldiers, he said, "It is worthy of your very effort, because nowhere in the world is presented a government of so much liberty and equality. To the highest and poorest among us are held out the highest privileges and positions. The present moment finds me at the White House, yet there's as good a chance for your children as there were for my father's." Student debt, the widening chasm between wealth and work, and the inequitable criminal justice system threaten Lincoln's view of America's democracy. So what's the answer? Harold Holzer wrote in A Just and Generous Nation, Lincoln believed government could be an active instrument of change. It can be used to reshape economic life. It can establish a new and better set of rules for economic activity. It could be a tool for solving problems. We have much work that is unfinished. Let me bring up one more issue that's dominating the presidential election season and ask, what would Lincoln say about our current level of political discourse in America? Just turn on your TV or Twitter, and you will hear and see the most vile, disgusting, and dangerous rhetoric. Sadly, it's coming from the candidate, most of it, who represents the party of Abraham Lincoln. He's calling for banning Muslims from entering the United States. He wants to strongly consider closing mosques, and he suggests forcing citizens to register with the authorities to create a database of American Muslims. Enough is enough. There is no place in America for those who would divide our nation on race or religion. Our nation's founders fled religious persecution and placed great importance on religious freedom, enshrining it in the First Amendment. But throughout our history, many religious minorities have faced discrimination. Often waves of prejudice have been directed at the religions of recent immigrants. During Lincoln's time, it was those Germans, those Irish, and those Catholics whose loyalties were being questioned. The Chicago Tribune, under its storied editor and publisher, Joseph Medill, was rabidly anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. They were called Paddies, as Donald Miller writes in The City of the Century. Coarse, loud, hard-drinking, clannish, smelling of whiskey and boiled cabbage. Lincoln understood that it is the hard work and hopes of new Americans that can help ensure that our economy remains an engine of opportunity. I'm confident he never tolerated the language we are hearing today. In fact, he said as much when he was describing the anti-immigrant, nativist rise of the Know-Nothing Party. Here's what Lincoln said: "Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. When the Know-Nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes, foreigners, and Catholics." So I'll close with this. We live in uncertain and sometimes dangerous times. But if Lincoln could face down Wall Street, if he could channel the awesome power of the American people, if he could lay a foundation for a modern economy and create economic opportunity, and at the same time save the Union, drive a stake into the stubborn heart of slavery, and redeem the promise of the Declaration of Independence, all while writing some of the most powerful words in our history, surely we can find a way through our present troubles. And despite this contentious election season, I'm optimistic there's still a passion and longing in America that Lincoln believed we could and must become. His wisdom and example continue to offer hope and guidance. We just need to listen. And I believe that just as Lincoln did, we'll turn to the better angels of our nature and choose love over hate, courage over fear, and tolerance over bigotry. We still have unfinished work to do, and let's do it together. Enough for me. I'd like to hear from you, try to answer a few questions. Thank you.